Thank you for coming to the Wheeler Centre for this conversation around the film One Night the Moon, directed by Rachel Perkins. My name's Tony Birch. I'm going to make an immediate apology. I had my front tooth knocked out yesterday, so if I sound a bit lispy, it's not because I have a lisp, or if I do, I only have one for today and I should be right by tomorrow, so please excuse that. I've got a very fortunate experience today to have a guest who not only can talk about the text that we're focusing on for VCE, but in a sense has had a central role in the making of that text. Kaarin
That'll do as my name. I'm happy to be Kaarin.
Kaarin Fairfax has had a remarkable career as an actor and a performer. A lot of it I knew about, some of it I didn't know much about, and I'm thankful to the World Wide Web. I was able to find out that I knew that Kaarin was a singer, but I didn't know that her first band was called Wild Blue Yonder.
It was. Of
which it says there are known recordings. So if you ever can find a recording of Wild Blue Yonder out there, it's worth probably a lot of money.
Or none.
Kaarin also performed as, which I do know about, as Mary Jo Star. And one of Kaarin's top hits to come out of that period was Kissing in a Taxi, which is just a beautiful title for a song, which I would highly recommend as long as you're not driving, of course. And I then YouTubed Kissing in a Taxi and found that there was no YouTube or no film clip of Mary Jo Star's Kissing in a Taxi either. So you had this very elusive career as a singer.
Maybe none of it's true.
Maybe. But more importantly for us this afternoon or this evening, Kaarin also, of course, plays Rose in this wonderful film, the mother of the daughter Emily who goes missing. And of course, as we all know, if we've done a bit of our homework, Emily is also played by Kaarin's real-life daughter, Memphis Kelly. So the connection of family is central to the film, but certainly also central to the making of this film. And we're going to get on and talk about that very quickly. What I want to say, though, just as a way of introduction, and looking at this theme and thinking about the imagination and place, is to often, if we're looking particularly about Indigenous or stories revolving around Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, we do think about landscapes that are out there and really don't have a lot of resonance or possibly relevance to us living in big cities. Just as we're sitting here today, though, I want you to reflect on just two small stories to give you a sense of the richness of Aboriginal history in Melbourne, and certainly the notions of conflict which are central to this theme between colonial forefathers and Aboriginal people. Now, just across the way from here at the Queen Vic Center, the Queen Vic Center stands on the site of the Queen Victoria Hospital, and in the early 1870s, a man named William Barrack, who was a very important and very famous Wurundjeri man, an Aboriginal man from this country, was forced to walk through the streets of Melbourne with his dying son David and admit his son to the hospital here in the early 1870s. And David was taken from his father. His father was removed from the hospital, forcibly removed from the hospital, and his father never saw his son again, who not only died in the hospital but was buried in common ground without his father ever knowing that his son had died. And when you consider the history of someone like William Barrack, it's a terrible indictment of that period of history. Or if you were to take a walk 5 minutes down to the Victoria market, where we do love to shop for our fruit and vegetables and meat, and certainly have a coffee, and often bring tourists to the Queen Victoria market, you may also know, or maybe don't know, that the front section of the Victoria market is actually the common burial ground of all Aboriginal people who died in the Port Phillip area up until about 1850. So there are many Aboriginal people lying in ground at the Victoria market, people whose lives, let alone their deaths, have never been recognised. So I think when you reflect on this theme, whether it be this film, whether it be possibly Alistair MacLeod's wonderful story collection Island, or any of the other texts that you're looking at, is to think also about this place. And I know that in this thing that you're doing, there's a great opportunity for you to do your own imaginative writing. And I think one of the things that you could consider is how you write about your place as much as how you consider other places. Okay. So with that introduction, one of the things I wanted to start immediately with Kaarin, because she was involved in the making of this, of course, is one of the things that strikes you about looking at the film, and certainly one of the repeated comments about the film is actually the landscape, the cinematography in the film. But Kaarin, I wonder if you could talk about the place where the film was made. And as Kaarin reminded me, it is now 15 years ago, but in a sense of what impact did the landscape have, not so much on the film itself, but the filmmaking process?
Yeah, look, it was such a beautiful area to film in, the Flinders Ranges, and we went out there as a family. It was, Paul and our daughters, Maddie, who was the older sister, and Memphis, who played Emily. And for all of us, the feeling of being in that landscape, you felt really kind of safe, at the same time overwhelmed with the beauty, and also overwhelmed with the harsh conditions, and that people would, make a choice to live out there. In terms of all of us being out there as a team and making this, kind of challenging story, the landscape helped us so much in telling it. There was a whole lot of stuff we didn't have to do because the landscape did it for us. It was rugged, it was tough, but it was, it was charismatic, and it made you want to know it and explore it. And we just had a Mitsubishi Magna, and if we got any spare time, we'd all just pile in the Magna and just bash our way through tracks and find stuff. It was the most sensational place to explore and be in. And I think, listening to you talk, the topic is tragic, and my family certainly refer to this movie as, the genre of the tragic musical. At the same time, I can't help feeling the beauty of it as well. I guess, the notion of the tracker and his family, being so connected to that land. I think more than anything, the song that Kelton and Paul sing about, this land is mine, this land is me, is extraordinary. I haven't really listened to it for many, many years, but that song is within me, and it changed my life hearing that, and certainly being part of the film changed my life.
One of the things that Kaarin actually raises there, and when we're thinking about the imaginative landscape, is the notion of to consider what impact the landscape has on you. How do you behave differently in different places? And of course, what impact do you have on the land? And it is that relationship with your writing that I think you need to consider very strongly. Even if you think about different places that you walk, places that you're very attracted to, places that have very strong positive memories, places that make you feel a little bit uneasy. The two things that we're thinking of there are, again, our impact on place and the impact of place on us. I want to talk and I want to ask Kaarin's view of this, because I do have a view which I'll put to you, but again, being involved in the production, there's a lovely, if you've seen the DVD, there's a lovely little sort of documentary attached to the film which it talks to some of the actors about the process. And I know Rachel Perkins and know her films quite well, and she's a very strong and very strong-minded director, but the other thing that came across clearly in the discussions I saw were the input that each of the actors had into how they felt that the film should be made. One of the interpretations, Kaarin, and I think it's a little simplistic, is that you have this opposition. Jim, the character played by Paul Kelly, the farmer, he is the owner of the land in that sort of European sense, whereas Albert, played by Kenton Pell, is in fact part of the land, or again, he is a custodian of land. And I think one of the things that the discussion of the film takes up is that you have this neat opposition. Owner in a European sense, attachment in an Indigenous sense. And some of the discussion hinges on the fact that that's where the tension, the conflict and the anxiety comes from. But my sense is that while that's true, In fact, it's a much deeper anxiety felt by Jim, and I think the anxiety felt by Jim is one that often preoccupies the colonial mindset, is that I think that what worries him so much about Albert is that Albert's actual knowledge of land, his ability to read the land rather than just the fact that he's part of it, which is a bit more passive.
Yeah. I agree, absolutely. I guess thinking back 15 years when we made that film, there weren't a lot of films being made by Aboriginal filmmakers. So to have a story, you know, we really tried to, we simplified the story for ourselves as well. The notion of taking on a story that was going to be mainly sung, like an opera, and had a deep heart to it, was important for us to make sure that it was told in a very simple way. Looking at it now and looking at it then, I guess there is always that thing, and you know, I guess it is about being dominant male, and certainly the notion of the tracker. Yeah, he comes with respect. You know, he's respected by the police force. He comes with a notion of the land. He comes, you know, you feel his connection to, you know, sky and to earth. And this poor man, Jim, who really seems out of place, and you kind of wonder what he is doing out there with his family, trying to be a farmer on land that's just really difficult. Yeah, you feel that he is threatened. He's threatened in... he doesn't want to be seen as less than. And I think it is a pride. I think it's pride that stops him saying, please go find my child, you know. It's as simple as that. I think it's that stubborn, arrogant pride. And also, I think a racism where he just doesn't understand it. He doesn't understand a different culture. He doesn't even believe in a different culture. You know, it's his way and that way is it. And don't give me any of that spiritual stuff because, you know, that will that will make me have to think differently, and I'm not prepared to.
But I think that's really powerful, though, because I think that when it's just make sure we don't get, I think, again, drawn into a simple notion that it's just, you know, money or material. And I think the term pride and arrogance are so apt, because that is the tragedy in the outcome, that it's what stops him from allowing Albert to find the child. It's not greed, it is pride, and I think that's really important.
Well, and it's important too, even now, you know, we all know people who stop doing things because of their pride doesn't let them, or they believe that they are so right. And, you know, where we live and the way that we all need to live together is to listen to others' opinions and, you know, take it or leave it, really. But, you know, the way it happened was there was a really tragic outcome because of this person's ignorance and, you know, in the end, stupidity.
Can I then just ask a little bit about, say, the difference between the shift between Rose and the inability to shift from Jim's perspective? Because I'm interested in the fact that Rose she's clearly apprehensive about Albert. So there are those, I think, two important moments. There's the one where they're in the coach and they pass the family on the road, and Emily waves and Rose stops her from doing that, from engaging. And then, of course, that quite poignant scene when Albert is in the bedroom and he's beginning the journey of tracing what's happened to Emily. And you can see that, if not fear, certainly apprehension in Rose of seeing him in the bedroom, but even as he walks past and then he gives her the child's toy to try and lessen that. What I'm interested in here, and particularly of playing the role, is that I think that we don't doubt that Jim loves his daughter. He loves her dearly, I think, but his inability to shift, and you've talked about his arrogance or his pride, what do you think takes place in Rose that allows her to transform from someone who fears Albert to someone who needs Albert? Is it just the fact he can find my daughter, or through that journey is there something about Albert and Aboriginal people that she discovers in that process?
Yeah, I think it's more the second notion. I certainly decided, you know, the choices I made to play her, being a woman in that period of time, really not being given a voice. and, you know, very much her role, wife, mother, housekeeper. So driving along the road, child waves to child. I think in her deeper being, she's quite happy, but that's not the way it's done. So wouldn't want to be seen to be, you know, doing anything outside of what's expected. And, you know, the church had probably said, you know, this is the way you behave, so let's behave like that. You know, let's not rock the boat, let's not draw any attention, let's keep it all very, I think she's very subservient. When she has the experience, and I think she'd do anything to get that child back. The thing that used to drive me crazy in the film was that she had to sit there, you know, because if it was me, I'd be out there just like, you know, out there looking. But she wasn't allowed to, so she has to wait. When she does meet Albert in the room, I think there's a connection, and I believe that she knows. She's on a more sensory level, so less intellectual, more sensory, that she has a connection with Albert. And there's some unspoken something that occurs, and as we know, there's not a lot of dialogue in the film, but there is like a heart connection or a soul connection there, and he transmits something, or she, you know, and she knows he can find that he will find her, find her daughter. Her fear is more inbuilt, but certainly I tried to have underneath there that she wanted. Her fear was more. She wanted to relax, but she had never had the experience before of being that close to someone like Albert, so she just didn't know how to behave.
It's interesting you use that word sensory, because, you know, there's not a lot of dialogue in the film, and again, I think it's interesting because we could make a mistake in thinking, well, there's not a lot of dialogue because it's a musical, so we sing the action. But in fact, there's long periods in the film where there is no dialogue nor singing. And that's interesting, because one of the things that I've only just thought of as you was talking, in a way, it allows the sensory relationship between characters and overcoming that apprehension, or even in Jim's case, exacerbating it. So much is conveyed through the unspokenness. So it is emotional, and it is, I suppose, physical in the way that people's bodies work. So how do you think that how strong is that? And particularly as an actor, how did you go about using other forms of communication when you didn't have either the song or the dialogue? Well,
I love that. I love the no speaking thing. I love the the quiet moments. I love that. The more I find as an actor, the more I speak or I give you, the less you're likely to come to me. If I can, as an actor, if I sit here and I just look over here at Tony for a little bit. You're watching me. I'm far more engaging when I'm quiet.
That's spooky, actually.
Yeah. So in terms of a film like that, I always thought of it more like an art piece. You know, it was like you stand and you look at a piece of art and you kind of want to go into it. And I think that was the beauty of the script, that it left space for you guys to like invest. It left space for the story to kind of tell itself, and we didn't know a lot of the answers, and it allows you guys to have more of your own experience than us going, oh, please just have this experience that we want you to have.
Who was that you were doing there?
That was just me doing some weird person telling you to do something that you didn't have to do.
It's really instructive, because I would suggest that, obviously when you're doing these things, you look at the films and look at them several times, I would imagine, and I think it is important. When you're looking at it again, look at the way the characters interact physically, the way that their bodies turn toward or away from each other, the eye contact or the lack of eye contact, because it is so reliant on that physical and that emotional space between the actors. I wanted to ask you something about the moon, because I think it's really instructive here, because I was thinking of the way that the moon as a motif works in this. So I'll just run a couple and then put the question to you. Because obviously we have this beautiful opening of the moon. So, cinematically we see this beautiful full moon, which has, I think for people over romantic connotations or possibly anxious connotations, we know that things go a bit awry on the full moon. So it is very symbolic, both in what we might call a European colonial sense and certainly in an Indigenous sense in a very different way. And then you've got that wonderful moment where the song, where the lullaby about the moon, where you see the family together in a genuinely loving situation. So Rose and Emily are on the bed singing the song, which is quite beautiful, and then Jim comes in and it's this wonderful idyllic family moment. And then of course we have the scene following soon after where Emily leaves to follow the moon. So what I'm interested in there is that in fact you could say, well, one of the issues here is that this dominant object in the sky is what draws Emily away from the family home. So you could even start to ascribe blame if you're pretty simplistic about it. But one of the things that struck me is that, again, in some of the readings of this sort of landscape, the landscape is often described as hostile or brutal or violent, etc. It's not. In fact, what I was thinking is that there's nothing violent or hostile about the land. It's what people ascribe to it, or what meaning people create from it. Because when I asked you at the opening about filming in this landscape and you were so taken with it, it seems that a character like Jim, it's not only that he's not part of it, is his refusal to even attempt to engage it.
I think that's true, yeah. And I think, just the notion of the moon was just great within the story because it is romantic. It's, to follow the moon seems like a wonderful fairy tale. And I think in the real story, it comes from a real story, and I think there was this kid did climb out their window. It was a boy, and to follow the moon. So it comes from the real deal.
Okay, now and just to follow up from that, and I think again one of the considerations of the film. This is I'm quoting here from a comment on the film. There is a way in which the land will reject the white man and make him pay. Now, again, it's a follow-up question and similar. It seems to me a very simplistic way because the land's not making him pay. It seems to me that, again, he pays the price of his own actions, of his own behaviour. There was nothing ascribed from the land to him. And what I want to know here is generally, maybe in the making of the film or just your own thoughts, is it about people's willingness to engage with land or their inability to engage with land that can inhibit that possibility?
Well, I think that's true. I've just moved back into the city from living on the Mornington Peninsula for 12 years, and it's much easier to connect with the land there. I find it quite difficult walking around the city and feeling like I'm connected with the land, having the concrete between me and the ground. So I think a lot of it is choice, a lot of it's awareness. How connected. Most of us love to go to the beach or we love to go to the country. I think it's just always knowing that we're all connected together and all connected within something.
What about that? And again, it's certainly...
It was badly explained.
But no. As a bit of a devil's advocate, and this is absolutely central to what students need to consider for their writing, what about the notion of the comment, well, non-Indigenous people can't belong to land. They cannot understand the land in the way that Indigenous people can. What sort of comment would you make on that? Because your previous comment is clearly making an attempt to find location rather than dislocation.
Well, again, I think it's choice. We can choose to have a spiritual connection to our history, to our to where we live, to know that I always say to my kids, who are quite grown up now, just don't forget we're floating on a ball in the middle of the universe. There's no strings. We're just like on this thing. It's pretty incredible, and like let's not forget that. you know, we know things have energy. We know we feel better when we're at the beach or when we're walking in the bush. You know, these things are when times are tough and we feel it all oppressed down upon us. Just remembering that stuff is a kind of great relief. I don't know how you feel, but I've always found it a really fabulous thing to remember my connection, spiritual connection to, you know, land and sea and air and.
Okay, I want to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to just make a comment again on these histories of lost children. One of the when Rachel Perkins came on board for the film, and people, if you've seen the documentary, you'll know this, is that in the not the original story, but in the script that was being prepared, Jim is in the script, or was in the script, for about half of the film, and then he's not there for the second half at all. So you don't have that moment toward the end of the film when Rose comes back and Albert's carrying the child that he's there. There's clearly reference that there was a lot of discussion between the cast about the script, and people, as I said earlier, your input to the script was welcomed. Can you remember, or have you still got thoughts now on how the cast related to the script and the sorts of discussions you had about where you think your character possibly might shift in relationship to what had already been written?
Look, I think there was probably a lot more discussion with John Romerell and Paul and Mairead and Kev than me. I was brought in later. The only things I really remember was the notion that, you know, that it was a true story, that Rachel decided to make it a girl because it seemed more vulnerable. Would we use our child? Freaky question. Really challenging as a mother to say yes, but I decided that it was important. Yeah, look, Rachel, I had and have great respect for Rachel as a filmmaker, and, you know, she pushed it in a direction and I think she was right.
What, your own daughter played Emily.
Yeah.
So your daughter in the film, Rose's daughter Emily, dies.
Yeah.
Did that have an emotional impact on you outside the film? In the sense of you and your daughter? Yeah,
we can't watch the movie. My other daughter, Maddie, who is in the film, her pigtail is in the film, but she likes to remind everyone, was invited to friends. They said, "Oh, come and watch One Night at the Moon at our place." And she just looked at them and said, "Why? Why would I? My sister dies, my mother is really miserable in it, and my father kills himself." So, you know, it was a little bit hard for our family to watch that movie and go, "Great movie."
But it is interesting because I think there are really strong universal themes in the film, and that is we all understand that loss of a child, and we all understand the fracture of families, and it's one of the things that, whatever our context there are to the film, when you think about what you want to write about, you're talking about people in places that they love or attempting to find an attachment to, or people who cannot find that attachment to place, and the consequences of that.
And everyone wants the best, you know. People kind of all doing their best, but there's, you know, got limits. Yeah.
Now, just before we open up for discussion, and by the way, part of the discussion, I teach writing at Melbourne University, so if any of the questions, if you want to ask questions about how you might write imaginatively about this or some of the other texts, please do put your hand up. One of the things, again, I opened tonight by talking about local context, about place, and for you to think about, we're right here in the centre of Melbourne. One of the other things, that the stories of lost children, real-life stories, are very common. I'm not talking about mythologies here or folk tales, I'm talking about real stories. And I was talking to Kaarin out the back, and one of the stories that I know quite well through family experience, and certainly as a researcher, is that there's a story based on a real-life experience here in Victoria, the Jane Duff story. If you were to go to the town of Garoke in the Western District of Victoria, which is Jadwajali country, Indigenous country, you'll find a memorial there to an 8-year-old girl, Jane Duff, who the memorial tells us, I think for 6 days, was lost in the bush with her baby brother, and she protected her baby brother and saved his life, and thus became a young heroine of the area. It's a story that was told for many years in school pantomimes every Christmas, And it's a story that what were called in those days the Victorian school reader, where you used to do set readers at school, that the story appeared in the Victorian school reader over and over again. In that story and in the pantomime, there's a clownish and childlike Aboriginal man in that story. And in the story he is asked and approached, will he track the children? And he is so childlike that he simply lays on the ground and rolls around laughing and laughing, because the notion that he could do something so important, so intellectual, so skilled is absurd to him. So in those stories, what is reinforced is the strength of the colonial child, the strength of colonial society, and the childlike primitive behaviour of this uncivilised man. The true story is very different. Those children went missing on Aboriginal land. No one could find the children, so the local authorities went to the Antwerp mission, where Aboriginal people had been incarcerated and forced from their land onto the mission, and they asked for an experienced Aboriginal tracker to help find the children. And in fact, the tracker who volunteered, and you could imagine why some Aboriginal people may not have volunteered considering how they'd been treated, the Aboriginal tracker tracked the children and found them and saved them, and his reward was to be sent back to the mission and to be incarcerated again. Now, it's an important story to tell because one is the facts of the story are always known. Although I'm a historian and researcher, it doesn't take much effort to find the factual story, but it's an example of Aboriginal stories being written out of the colonial narrative, because I think, and we talked about this earlier, is that what that story shows is the power of Aboriginal knowledge of land. Like Albert, this man had incredible understanding of how to read land, and that, in a sense, is the great anxiety, I think, that white Australia had to deal with, that people who were here before colonial society, in fact, knew country in a much more profound way. And we talked about this before. We think that's what Jim can't come to terms with, that Albert knows more about this place than he does. Not that he has a piece of paper that says he owns it. Okay. Now, we've got questions, we've got microphones, and we'll take questions certainly directly on the text, but any questions that you might want to ask generally about this text or certainly some of the other texts in this imaginative landscape, particularly if you're interested in asking any questions about Alistair MacLeod.
And I've got a script here if anyone wants to have a look at it. That's one of the working scripts.
Okay, so who would like to ask the first question?
Hi, Meg Tasker. Just wanted to check out a rumour that I got from YouTube about the story originally, or hinting at the disappearance of Albert and his wife's daughter in the course of the story. One of the YouTube clips sort of gives a bit of background to the whole historical incident and the process of the film being made, and says that there was a parallel between the lost child following the moon and the stolen child of the Aboriginal family. Now, I didn't pick any of that up when I saw the film itself.
No.
Was there anything in the discussions or the sort of changes to the script that you can remember?
No, none from that. But look, it may have been from the original that it was simplified and decided to not deal with such weighty topics. Possibly that happened before I came on board.
Are you saying the disappearance of Albert's child at the time that he...
I'd be interested to know if it's just a complete furphy that's turned up on YouTube in someone, well-intentionedly embroidering, or whether there might have been something somewhere along the way in the historical background, or because it was set in the 1930s, wasn't it?
1932. Look, one thing that I certainly haven't read anything of that nature. I think
don't write that down.
There are two important points of context, and you can write these ones down. Is that one, the story that I just told about Antwerp is that it is in fact clear that the Aboriginal man who saved Jane Duff and her brother is from a community that many children eventually were taken from their family, and that's documented as well. If you go to the cemetery at the mission, it's a terrible experience to go to the cemetery and see the unmarked graves of the Aboriginal children at one time of the year. You go another time of the year and all the bulbs come up in the shape of very small rectangles of where children have been buried. So children dying here in unmarked graves and certainly children being removed. And I do know that the filmmaker in this case of the documentary, Michael Riley, the late Michael Riley, a wonderful Aboriginal filmmaker, certainly part of his brief as a filmmaker was to tell stories which reconnected his family, which had certainly suffered forced separation from the Stolen Generations policies.
Yeah,
so,
you're right. It's not just a little point, is it? It's
no, so whether it occurred to Albert, I'm not sure, but certainly the removal of children would have certainly occurred within his community. And the other thing we could note here, these are very strongly documented stories across Australia of Aboriginal trackers working very hard to save the lives of Europeans, and we would know that in those areas, descendants or direct family members of those trackers would have certainly been separated from their families.
And I teach lost child stories, and the stolen generation is a constant haunting presence when you're discussing lost children, because even the words sort of almost morph themselves into lost and stolen. So it gets a little bit uncanny sometimes. Yeah. Thank you. I just was curious about that. Yeah.
Do you think Rose ever overcomes her fear of the land? And if so, why would that be the case if she's lost two of the most important people to her? Why would she overcome her fear? Wouldn't she fear it more? That's just what I saw from it.
Good question. So it would be her ongoing story, really, like what becomes of Rose after that. That might be a good story to write. I think that my feeling was that she'd almost go and live with the Aboriginal people, you know, that whatever they had to offer she wanted to know more of. That's if she survived. I don't know that she was ever particularly frightened of the land. In a way, I felt like she was more just generally frightened, you know. She seemed like a little white girl in the middle of somewhere with a husband, and I don't know how good their communication particularly was. And then she found something deeper that she could relate to, and that was a spirituality. And my feeling was that she possibly, you know, kind of went against everything else and just really worked on her connection with the land and the Aboriginal people. But I don't know, that's just
the other thing, there is, though, Kaarin, an interesting point to the question, again, a little more broadly, and that is that again, thinking of the theme and thinking what you might want to write about, is that if there is tragedy within landscape, the way that we react will depend on how we view that place. So, for instance, often when, unfortunately, people who love the sea die at sea, so occasionally surfers or fishers, etc., particularly if surfing people die at sea, the notion of commemoration is about the sea being a place they love. So the sea isn't seen as a menace. The sea isn't seen as the perpetrator of death. The sea is seen as something that's part of that person. Now that's very interesting because, again, it goes back to the point I asked Kaarin earlier, is that why we might place blame on landscape, that the land is violent, and I don't think it is. I don't think landscapes are inherently violent, but I think for me that notion would be dependent on the sense, does she blame the land for Emily's death, or does she in fact recognise the death of Emily is not the fault of land but of the ignorance of colonial society? In that sense, addressing that question, I think would produce the outcome as whether she felt more attached to a place or not. It's where you ascribe blame, and I think to ascribe blame to landscape or to place is in fact an easy way out because it allows you to deflect.
Yep, that's good. He's right.
Yeah. Another question.
How would you explain the significance of Rose's dream where you see what seems to be Albert's hand and Emily's hand slipping away from each other?
Well, again, I think that's just her having a deeper connection somehow. Some spiritual thing opened up in her, and I think it felt like there was a connection between Rose and Albert on an unspoken level. So I think the dream reassured her that her decision that she had to make this decision. She had to go against what was expected and get in that, you know, on that horse and cart and just go and find Albert and say, I don't care about what people think, I don't care about what my husband thinks about this, we need to find her. And I think she absolutely, totally, 100% believed that he would, and he did.
And if you think of the linear time of the film, because you know that Albert is there when they arrive and they decide to look for Emily, Albert is present, and Jim gets a shock when he says, "What's he doing here?" And the notion that he's part of the police force is sort of a shock to him. I think that one of the ways that you could read it is that there was the potential at that moment, if they'd set out to find Emily with Albert, that connection wouldn't have been broken, and then that opportunity, it slips away. And I just think Kaarin saying, you're getting frustrated with her sitting on that veranda because you wanted her to go. I think that what it's about is that the longer it goes on where he's not re-engaged, the notion of being able to find Emily alive just slips away as well. Yeah. And I said to Kaarin, and I'll ask for a response here, I saw this film many years ago and then I watched it again yesterday. And it's one of those films where I knew the ending, and yet when Rose and Albert set off in search of Emily and we know that they're about to find her, I'm saying to myself, I hope she's alive. But I knew that she wasn't. So how did you feel about, was there a discussion, or how did you feel about that ending? Did you want her to be alive, or would that have been a possibility as an alternate ending? Or
personally, I wanted her to be alive. I think for the story to be as powerful as it was, the child needed to not be alive. And that was a freaky moment, giving you an insight into the filming of it, because they made a dummy that just looked just like Memphis, right? And they had it there because it had to lie there for a while we shot it, and her sister and I were there, and it was just like, that is really freaky and weird. So, look, I think it was important that the child didn't survive, and certainly in terms of the story, the original story, the child, the young boy, was found like 300 metres behind the house in a clay pit, like not far away at all. So, I think Rachel was right in keeping it with a massively tragic end.
Okay, we've got time for one more. Yeah.
I watched it this afternoon too, again, after seeing it a long time ago. I'm curious to know, it seems to me that the filmmaking was rather brave and radical in that there was very little dialogue. Music told the story, almost an opera. Mm-hmm. Has that happened in Australia? I'm curious to know, has that happened in Australia since?
Not like that, I guess. What was the Hugh Jackman film we just saw? Les Miserables. You know, I mean, that's got a similar thing where it is kind of operatic. Certainly, you know, when they started writing the music and the reels and all, like the Irish reel sounding songs, and the songs started coming, we knew that the emotion would be within, because most of it is scored, so even when people are talking, often there's score going underneath, music going underneath. What was your question again? Sorry.
Whether there'd been something done since then, or similar.
I don't think, not like that I know of, and certainly there were a lot of discussions, even as we're shooting day to day, going, this is either going to be really good or really bad, you know, because the idea of a fun drama could have been absolutely horrid. I think the reason it worked so well is the story is very powerful, and all of the people involved in the creation of it are the best at what they do, and I think, you know, I think that's why it worked.
Look, I think that's a great question, because I think I reflected on something similar rewatching it. I think that, again, with the gap of years for me looking at it, it is not only such an innovative film and a brave film that I think people are fearful of taking up that approach, or that maybe they're not creative enough, or the dollars work differently in film. They work in strange ways. So I think it's a really important point. Now, for you students, I think the point that was just been raised by the questioner is that you've really got a wonderful opportunity here. This is a truly great Australian film. It's absolutely mesmerising. It was for me to watch it again. I went down to JB Hi-Fi to try and get the soundtrack this afternoon and can't get it. So if anyone knows where they stock this, please let us know, because I want to purchase it. In relationship and in closing, is that clearly what this film offers for all of us is a different way of thinking about Australia, a different way of thinking about our place in Australia, and I think in a very generous way. A lot of the stories of what you might call colonial Indigenous conflict often allow us little space to manoeuvre, because, for some good reason, there's a lot of tension, a lot of conflict, and stories are sometimes oppositional. I think what this story does, it does allow the potential for us not only to think in a progressive way about how we act together, how we live in a place together, but it does it in a way, I think, that is truly poetic, purely artistic, and I think that you'll get a lot out of it. What we always say at the finish of these events, which we mean in a heartfelt way, we know that VCE is a very tough year. We know it's a very busy year, or busy 2 years, depending on where you're at with your VCE. We at the Wheeler Centre wish you all the best with your study, and we hope that the sessions helped you think more about this text. And we hope you have a great year. And, of course, as we always do in closing, the most important thing is to thank our guest, Kaarin Fairfax.
And thank you all, because I feel very privileged to have been part of this project, and it's lovely to know that it's being studied, because I think the topics involved are really important. So go get them, gang.